You think you know this story? What if the truth isn't about a stranger, but hidden within the conflicting statements of the friends themselves? Just weeks after Madeleine McCann vanished, investigators found unexplainable contradictions. One witness who saw an abductor, and another who swore it was impossible. They found shifting timelines, an impossible view from the restaurant, and what was later called a pact of silence. If you want to follow every twist and hidden detail of this case, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video. The place was called the Ocean Club, but it was not so much a location as it was a system. It promised a specific, curated kind of freedom, a temporary and welcome release from the demanding schedules of professional life. They had arrived not merely as individual families on holiday, but as a collective. They were a tight-knit circle, friends and colleagues, physicians and consultants, people who understood the pressures of a life measured in minutes and high-stakes decisions. This was their time, earned and meticulously planned. The very atmosphere seemed different within its confines, lighter, insulated from the judgment and the noise of the world they had left behind. This was not their first holiday of this kind. They were veterans of this particular brand of escape, and they slipped into its rhythms with the ease of long practice. The rhythm of the holiday established itself almost immediately, a precise and unbroken schedule that would govern their days. Mornings began not with lazy family breakfasts, but with a brisk, energetic purpose. The children, still soft and warm with sleep, were delivered to the organized activities of the resort's kids club. It was an efficient, seamless transaction. The staff, bright and practiced, knew the routine. The parents, now unencumbered, turned their full attention to their own pursuits. The sharp, percussive sound of a tennis ball striking the taut strings of a racket became the soundtrack of their mornings. Rallies were played on the courts with a friendly but distinct intensity. This was a group accustomed to succeeding, to pushing themselves, even in their leisure. They were fit, energetic, and entirely focused on this adult world they had carved out for themselves. Laughter echoed, a sound of genuine release, a celebration of their brief, shared autonomy. They were not parents in these moments. They were simply themselves, friends enjoying the sun and the sport. Midday offered a brief, functional intersection. The group reconvened, collected the children, and shared a meal. It was a short, sometimes hurried pause before the afternoon schedule commenced. For the children, this meant nap time, a mandated quiet period. For the adults, it was a continuation of their freedom. Once the children were settled, they were returned to the care of the kids' club for the remainder of the afternoon. The children, it seemed, existed in a parallel world. It was a world of structured play, painting, and supervision, managed by professionals. The adults inhabited another. To the staff who observed them, the pattern was notable. It was, perhaps, unusual. Other families tended to spend their days in scattered fluid units, moving between their rooms and the water's edge. This group, however, moved as one. They were a solid, almost impenetrable unit. Their solidarity was remarkable. They played tennis together, they relaxed by the pools together, and, as the staff would soon learn, they dined together. The children seemed to orbit this central, adult-focused gravity, visible at set times, but otherwise pleasantly and professionally managed from a distance. As the afternoon began to fade, a shift felt in the air. Rather than seen, the children were collected for the final time that day. This was the last exchange. They were taken back to their respective apartments, bathed, fed, and prepared for bed. The schedule was unwavering. By 8 o'clock, or perhaps just a few minutes after, a deep silence would fall over the children's rooms. They were asleep. The day's duties, as parents, were concluded. The system had worked perfectly. Now, the evening, their evening, could begin. The adults were free, ready to gather, to talk, to dine, and to reconnect. Their freedom felt complete, secure within the quiet, monitored, and perfect confines of their golden cage. The evenings at the resort began at precisely the same time for the group, just after 8 o'clock. With the children in their beds, the adults would gather, a tangible sense of release settling over them. They convened each night at the resort's tapas restaurant. It became their clubhouse, a predictable and comfortable space where they could reclaim their identities as friends and partners, not just as parents. The conversations were easy, the laughter genuine. It was the centerpiece of their holiday, this guaranteed block of adult time. But this shared ritual was built upon a critical decision. Their routine depended entirely on leaving their young children sleeping, alone, in the ground floor apartments. This choice was not made in a vacuum. The group was familiar with a particular kind of holiday, one where a baby listening service was standard. On previous trips, resort staff would monitor the rooms, offering parents a kind of electronic tether, a guarantee that any cry would be heard and acted upon. They had, it seems, arrived at the Ocean Club expecting the same convenience. They were informed, however, that no such service existed. The management was clear. The complex was too large, its layout too spread out. The official options offered were distinct and, to the group, undesirable. There was the Kids Club, which operated late into the evening, or for a fee, parents could hire an in-room babysitter. Neither option was taken. The group, so unified in their daily habits, was also unified in rejecting these solutions. A babysitter was a stranger, an intrusion into their private space during their brief holiday. The Kids Club, perhaps, felt too impersonal for the late hours. They wanted their children close, but they also wanted their own freedom. So, they created a solution. If the resort would not provide the system they required, they would invent one themselves. They called it a checking system. It was a plan born of their own logic, a system they would later argue was, in fact, more rigorous than any passive listening device. The plan was simple. They would dine together, as planned, at the tapas restaurant. Given its perceived proximity to their apartments, they would take turns. At regular intervals, one adult from the group would leave the table, walk the short distance, and physically check on the children in their respective rooms. Then they would return, and the evening would continue until the next check was due. To them, this seemed a perfect compromise. It was active, not passive. It was conducted by them, the parents, people who were emotionally invested, not detached employees. It allowed their evenings to remain unbroken, save for these brief, rotating interruptions. It was a system built on a fragile foundation of trust in the resort's safety, trust in the quietness of their children, and absolute trust in each other to perform their designated role. This arrangement, however, did not go unnoticed. To the Ocean Club staff, the group's behavior was peculiar. One employee noted their habits bluntly, stating that this was a very odd group because they never stay with their children in the evenings. The staff saw other families adjusting their schedules, eating earlier, or dining in shifts. They saw this group, lively and loud, drinking and talking for hours, while their children were somewhere else, unseen. The staff's quiet observation highlighted a stark disconnect. What the group saw as a diligent, responsible, and clever solution, the outside world saw as a strange and unsettling absence. The system was designed to provide them with peace of mind, to insulate their holiday pleasure from the anxieties of parenting. But this system, their own unique invention, created something else entirely. It created a predictable, reliable, and repeated gap in supervision. It created a window of time, every single night, when the children were verifiably, completely, and intentionally alone. It was the 3rd of May. The holiday was drawing to a close, and the mood at the tapas restaurant was relaxed, perhaps even more so than on previous evenings. The rhythm of their vacation had become second nature, a comfortable, shared script. The group gathered at their usual table shortly after 8:30, the children accounted for, asleep in their beds. The first bottle of wine was opened. The conversation was light, the laughter familiar. The system, their unique and trusted invention, clicked into operation, a silent engine driving the evening. The first check of the night on the McCann children fell to Jerry McCann. At approximately 5 minutes past 9, he excused himself from the table. He walked the short, familiar route to apartment 5A. The apartment was quiet. He entered and moved toward the children's bedroom. He would later recall that the bedroom door was open, perhaps wider than they usually left it. He peered inside. In the low light, he could make out the forms of his 3 children. They were sound asleep. Madeleine was in her bed, her twin siblings nearby. He felt the small, familiar reassurance of a parent. Nothing seemed amiss. He did not linger. He returned to the restaurant, reported that all was well, and slipped back into the conversation. The evening continued. The staggered checks were a part of the evening's flow, barely an interruption. Around 9:15, perhaps 10 minutes after Jerry's return, Jane Tanner left the table. It was her turn to check on her own children, who were sleeping in a different apartment. She walked up the narrow street. As she did, she saw Jerry McCann again. He was not at the restaurant. He was standing further up the road, talking with another man, a British holidaymaker they had met playing tennis. Jane passed them. At that same moment, another figure crossed her path, walking ahead of her and moving purposefully away from the resort complex. It was a man. He was carrying a child in his arms. The child was small, dressed in what appeared to be pajamas. It was a fleeting, unremarkable image. In the context of a family resort, a father carrying a sleepy child was a common sight. She thought nothing more of it. She did not connect the image to her friends or their children. She continued on, performed her own check, and returned to the restaurant, the momentary observation already dissolving from her mind. The timeline moved forward. The next check on the McCann children was due at approximately 9:30. This turn fell to Matthew Oldfield. He left the table and went to apartment 5A. His check, however, was different from Jerry's. He entered the apartment and stood in the living area. The children's bedroom door was, as Jerry had noted, open. Matthew listened from the doorway. He heard nothing. No stirring, no crying. Only the deep, absolute quiet that he associated with children soundly asleep. He did not go all the way into the room. He did not look at the beds. The silence was reassurance enough. He, too, returned to the table. He confirmed that all was quiet. The system, it seemed to everyone, was working perfectly. 3 times, the apartments had been visited. 3 times, the report had come back. All is well. The group was together again, complete. The night settled into its comfortable, carefree rhythm, the conversation and wine flowing, insulated by the perceived safety of their self-designed, self-managed world. The conversation at the table continued, easy and unhurried. The system had, by all accounts, performed its function. Another 30 minutes passed. The air was still. The resort settled into its late evening quiet. It was now 10 o'clock. It was Kate McCann's turn to make a check. Perhaps it was simply her rotation, or perhaps it was something else. A subtle, internal pull, an undefined maternal instinct that decided it was time. She excused herself from the group, leaving the familiar circle of light and conversation. She walked the path from the restaurant to apartment 5A. It was a route she now knew well, a short walk that had become part of the evening's architecture. She reached the door and let herself into the silent apartment. The living area was quiet, still. She moved toward the children's bedroom. The door, as her husband and their friend had both reported earlier, was open. She stepped toward it, expecting to peer in, see the 3 sleeping forms, and return to the table with the simple report that all was well. But the moment she reached the threshold, the world tilted. Something was immediately, terribly wrong. The room felt different. A draft of air moved against her skin. Her gaze was pulled not to the beds, but to the window. It was wide open. The external shutter, the heavy louvered barrier they always secured from the inside, was raised. It was pushed all the way up, leaving a dark, gaping void where a solid wall should have been. Her heart stopped. Her eyes flew to the beds. In their cots, the twins slept soundly. They had not stirred. They lay in the same deep, undisturbed peace as when she had left them hours before. But Madeleine's bed was empty. The covers were still there, but the small form that should have been under them was gone. A cold, paralyzing disbelief gripped her. It lasted only a fraction of a second, a moment of cognitive refusal, before it was consumed by a tidal wave of pure, visceral horror. This was not possible. She may have glanced around the room, a frantic, desperate scan into the corners, into the wardrobe, her mind clinging to the hope that this was a game, that her daughter was hiding. But the open window and the raised shutter screamed a different truth. This was not a child who had woken up and wandered out. This was not a nightmare. This was real. The silence of the apartment was shattered. She ran. She fled the room, leaving the sleeping twins, leaving the open window, and sprinted back the way she had come. She burst into the restaurant, a figure of pure panic. The friends at the table looked up, their smiles freezing. Her voice cut through the night, a raw, primal sound that bore no resemblance to the easy conversation of moments before. She cried out that Madeleine was gone. She was gone. The words tumbled out, fragmented by terror. They've taken her. In that instant, the holiday, the friendship, the entire careful structure of their lives fractured. The illusion of the golden cage evaporated. There was no thought, no analysis, only pure, adrenalized chaos. Chairs were thrown back. Glasses were abandoned. The group exploded into action, fanning out from the restaurant, their voices now shouting Madeleine's name into the quiet resort darkness, their minds reeling as they began a frantic, desperate search for the child who had vanished from her bed. The group's frantic search began with a desperate, unspoken assumption that she had wandered. They fanned out into the darkness, their calls echoing, checking the pools, the pathways, the laundry rooms, and the darkened recesses of the resort. Every shadow held a potential terror. But as the minutes stretched, the cold reality of Kate McCann's discovery began to settle over them, pushing aside the more innocent possibility. The open window and the raised shutter. That was not the work of a wandering toddler. That was the mark of an intrusion. The realization changed the nature of the search. The panic deepened, acquiring a new, sharper edge of horror. This was not a lost child. This was a child who had been taken. Yet in the vortex of this chaos, a critical, inexplicable void began to form. The realization of an abduction did not immediately translate into the one action that mattered most, a call to the police. Instead, the first calls were to the resort staff. The Ocean Club's internal security was alerted. Staff members, roused from their evening duties, joined the search, bringing torches and a semblance of organization. But this, too, was a search for a lost guest, not a hunt for a kidnapper. Precious time was evaporating. Every second that passed allowed the person who had climbed through that window to move further away. Still, the call to the authorities was delayed. The group, so unified and decisive in their holiday routines, seemed paralyzed by this catastrophic event. They were searching, running, and shouting, but they were not, it seems, communicating with the outside world. It was well after the initial discovery that the first official call was finally made. The gentry, the local GNR officers, were dispatched. These were not specialized detectives. They were the uniformed presence of the local constabulary, officers accustomed to minor disputes and public order. When they arrived, they entered a scene of total confusion. They were met by a large group of distressed, frantic adults. They were led to apartment 5A. By now, the apartment was no longer a scene. It was the frantic hub of the group's terror. People had been moving in and out of the room. The friends, the parents, the resort staff. They had touched the doors, the surfaces, the window frame itself. The GNR officers, in their turn, entered the children's bedroom. They, too, looked at the open window. They looked at the empty bed. They observed the sleeping twins, who had, miraculously, slept through the entire ordeal. They began asking questions, trying to piece together a timeline from the overlapping, panicked accounts. It was only after the GNR officers grasped the implications of the open shutter that the procedural gears finally, agonizingly, began to turn. This was not a matter for the local patrol. This was a potential abduction. This was a case for the serious crime investigators, the Policia Judiciaria. Another call was made. More waiting. It was estimated to be nearly 2 hours, 120 minutes after Kate McCann's first scream before the PJ detectives finally arrived. By the time their car pulled into the resort, the trail was cold. The scene, that small bedroom, was irretrievably compromised. Any microscopic trace, any fingerprint on the window latch, any fiber caught on the sill, had been touched, wiped, or obscured by the well-intentioned, frantic movements of nearly a dozen people. The investigators, the men who were trained to read the silent story left behind, arrived to find that the page had already been torn out. The investigation had begun with a devastating and permanent disadvantage. In the chaotic first hours, as the investigative police tried to anchor the shifting, panicked accounts, they searched for a fixed point, a single piece of objective fact. The group was separated, their memories harvested while still raw. They were asked to rebuild the evening, minute by minute, check by check. And it was here, in the reconstruction of the time between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, that the entire foundation of the case began to fracture. The story split, not into slightly different shades of truth, but into two opposing, mutually exclusive realities. The first reality was provided by Jane Tanner. Her account was precise, visual, and offered the single most powerful evidence that an abduction had occurred. She recounted leaving the restaurant at approximately 9:15. She walked up the road. She clearly recalled seeing Jerry McCann ahead of her, standing and talking to another man, Jeremy Wilkins, a holidaymaker they knew from tennis. As she passed them, she testified, another figure moved ahead of her, walking away from the apartment complex. It was a man. He was carrying a child. She noted the details. The man's clothing seemed somewhat heavy for the climate, and the child was small, dressed in light-colored pajamas. The man was walking with purpose, moving swiftly. At the time, the image was fleeting, unremarkable. A parent taking a sleepy child home. But in the horrifying light of what came later, her memory crystallized. That image became, for her and soon for the entire world, the central event. It was the moment of the abduction, captured by chance. Her sighting was the investigation's first and most critical lead. It provided a timeline. It provided a description. It provided confirmation of an intruder. Then, the investigators spoke to the other man on that road. Jeremy Wilkins was not a member of the group. He was an independent witness, a fellow tourist. He confirmed his part of the story. Yes, he was standing on that exact road at that exact time, approximately 9:15. Yes, he was engaged in a conversation with Jerry McCann. They were chatting, having just run into each other. He, too, had a small child with him, his own infant son. The investigators asked him to confirm the rest of the scene. Did he see Jane Tanner walk past? Did he see another man, walking quickly, carrying a child in pajamas? His answer was immediate, confident, and absolute. No. He stated unequivocally that no one had passed them. It was not a lapse in memory, he insisted. It was an impossibility. The road was narrow. He was standing there, attentive to his conversation and his own child. He was adamant that if another person, let alone two separate people first, a woman, then a man carrying a child had walked by, he would have seen them. He would have had to move. It would have registered. He saw no one. He did not see Jane Tanner. And he emphatically did not see any man carrying any child. The investigation was now confronted with an impossible paradox. These were not two stories that could be reconciled. They could not both be true. If Jane Tanner was correct, then Jeremy Wilkins, an independent witness, was somehow profoundly mistaken, inexplicably blind to two people passing within feet of him. His testimony would have to be dismissed as flawed. But if Jeremy Wilkins was correct, the implications were catastrophic. If he was telling the truth, then Jane Tanner did not see what she claimed to see. The man with the child, the sighting that defined the entire stranger abduction theory, the image that would launch a global search, was not real. It was a phantom. This was not a minor discrepancy. It was a chasm that opened up in the very heart of the timeline. One witness provided the key suspect. The other witness proved he could not have existed. The investigators were left frozen, staring into the void between two irreconcilable truths, trying to determine which story was the memory and which one was the illusion. The checking system, as the group had designed it, rested on two pillars of trust. The first was their trust in each other to perform the physical checks. The second, and perhaps more fundamental, was an unspoken trust in the environment itself. The selection of the tapas restaurant, the choice of that specific table night after night, was presented as a decision based on proximity. It felt close. It gave the impression of vigilance, as if they were separated from their sleeping children by only a few steps. It was a comforting illusion. This illusion, however, could not withstand scrutiny. As the initial chaos of the disappearance settled and the hard, procedural work of investigation began, that assumption of proximity was tested. Journalists, arriving from all over the world, sought to understand the mechanics of the evening. They, too, went to the tapas restaurant. They stood where the group had Saturday, and they looked toward apartment 5A. What they discovered was not a poor view, or a partially obscured view. What they found was no view at all. The line of sight was not simply difficult, it was non-existent. A permanent, opaque barrier, part of the restaurant's design to shield diners, stood in the way. Alongside it, a line of dense, established shrubs formed a solid wall. From their table, the friends could not have seen the front of their apartment. They could not have seen the door. They could not have seen the children's bedroom window. They could not have seen a person approaching the apartment, or a person leaving it. Any notion of watching the children, even in the most abstract sense, was an absolute impossibility. This singular, physical fact changed the complexion of the group's entire arrangement. It reframed their nightly routine. The system they had created was not an enhancement of their watchfulness. It was the only thing they were doing. The checks, 30 minutes apart, were not supplemental to a watchful gaze. They were isolated moments of supervision in a vast, dark window of complete separation. The knowledge of this physical barrier altered the emotional mathematics of the night. It rendered the choice of that table, that restaurant, as one of pure convenience, not vigilance. It was close only in the sense that it made the walk for the designated checker shorter. It offered no other protective benefit. The group was, in fact, dining completely blind to the location where their children slept. This discovery resonated deeply with the suspicions already forming within the Portuguese investigation. The group's story had already begun to fray. The glaring contradiction between Jane Tanner and Jeremy Wilkins had created a vacuum of doubt. Now, this physical reality seemed to pull at another critical thread. It was around this time that a small, seemingly bureaucratic detail emerged in the local press, a detail that signaled the hardening of the investigators' perspective. In reports, Kate McCann was repeatedly referred to not by her married name, but as Kate Healy, her maiden name. It was the same way, it was noted, that the lead detective insisted on referring to her. This was not an error. It was a pointed, clinical act of separation. It subtly dismantled the public-facing image of the unified, grieving family. It reframed her as an individual, Kate Healy, a person whose account was being weighed and measured with objective, cold detachment. It was the language of an investigator who was no longer viewing the person across the table as a victim, but as a component of the mystery itself. The smallest details had begun to accumulate, casting long shadows. The impassable void where a view should have been. The peculiar, formal insistence on a maiden name. These were not clues to what had happened, but rather, they were indicators of a deep structural flaw in the narrative the world had been given. The foundation of the group's story was threatening to collapse, not from an external attack, but from its own internal, unsupportable weight. The contained internal panic of the first night could not hold. The story of the missing child broke, not as a ripple, but as a tidal wave. News traveled fast, carried by British media outlets even before many local Portuguese authorities were fully briefed. The quiet, sun-drenched resort of Praia da Luz was transformed, seemingly overnight. It ceased to be a holiday destination and became a dateline, the global focal point of an agonizing mystery. Satellite trucks crowded the narrow, cobbled streets. Reporters and camera crews established a near-constant, watchful presence, their long lenses trained on the apartments, the restaurant, and the faces of the group. This sudden, intense, and blinding international spotlight changed the nature of the investigation itself. It applied a new, immense pressure. not just on the Portuguese police, to whom this level of scrutiny was unfamiliar, but on the group of friends at the center of the storm. Into this chaotic, high-stakes environment stepped a man named Robert Murat. He was, in many ways, the perfect intermediary. He was a British-Portuguese local, a man who spoke both languages fluently and lived with his mother in a villa, just a short distance from the Ocean Club. He presented himself as a concerned member of the community, someone uniquely positioned to help. He offered his services as an informal translator, a guide to bridge the inevitable gap between the grieving, English-speaking family and the Portuguese investigators. He was visible, eager, and seemingly helpful. He appeared to move with ease through the different, colliding worlds: the police cordon, the media pack, and the periphery of the family's circle. His assistance was, at first, accepted. He seemed to understand the system, the people, and the place. But in an investigation where every new face was a new variable, helpfulness itself could acquire a different, more troubling shape. As the PJ detectives methodically gathered statements, they asked everyone to recount the chaotic hours of the search. Who was there? Who did you see? Jerry McCann and several of his friends were specific. They recalled this helpful man, Robert Murat. They placed him at the resort, near the center of the frantic search, on the very night Madeleine disappeared. His presence was, to them, a fact, a fixed point in the blur of that terrible evening. This testimony, however, clashed directly with the recollections of others. The GNR officers, the first uniformed police to arrive, were questioned. The Ocean Club staff, who had been pulled from their duties to search the grounds, were also asked. Their statements were consistent. They had no memory of Robert Murat being there that night. In their clear recollection, he had not appeared on the scene until the following morning, well after the sun had risen and the media presence had begun to swell. The investigation was now faced with its third critical fracture. The first was the impossible physics of the shutters. The second was the phantom abductor seen by one witness and rendered invisible by another. And now this, a man who, according to the group, was present in the vital, immediate aftermath, but who, according to local staff and police, was absent. For the Portuguese detectives, this contradiction was a powerful catalyst. It pointed not to a vague, shadowy stranger, but to a specific, identifiable person. His eagerness, which had first appeared helpful, was re-examined. His proximity, his seamless insertion into the crisis, began to look less like coincidence and more like a disturbing, proprietary interest. The group's testimony, perhaps offered as a simple observation, had instead painted a target. This was enough. The investigation, starved of forensic leads and frustrated by conflicting accounts, now had a tangible direction. Robert Murat was formally named an arguido. This was not a criminal charge, but it was a profound public and legal shift in his status. He was no longer a helpful translator or a concerned local. He was the first official suspect. The investigation was now moving in two divergent directions. One path followed the ghostly trail of a potential stranger, an abductor who materialized on a dark road for one witness and evaporated for another. The other path led investigators back, again and again, to the group of friends, to the table where they sat, and to the stories they told. With the public identification of Robert Murat as a suspect, the police had demonstrated their focus. But privately, a deeper, more profound frustration was setting in. The contradictions were mounting. They were no longer simple discrepancies, the kind of small, understandable errors born from panic and the fog of memory. The conflicting timelines, the impossibility of the view from the restaurant, the discrepancy over Murat's presence, they had begun to feel less like random fragments and more like pieces of a broken, badly mended story. The group's accounts seemed to shift, to subtly recalibrate, as if seeking a state of equilibrium. The investigators felt they were not interviewing individuals. They were interviewing a single, unified entity. In the formal setting of the interviews, the friends presented a remarkable, and to the police, an unnerving, solidarity. They were articulate, intelligent professionals. They were also controlled. Their grief, while evident, seemed to be channeled through a shared understanding. The atmosphere in these sessions was not one of desperate, chaotic recollection. It was one of increasing friction, a sense of procedural combat. The investigators were pushing for raw, unfiltered memory. The group, it seemed, was providing a curated, collective narrative. This unity, which in the first hours had been a source of comfort for the group, now became a primary focus of the investigation. Why were their stories so aligned in some places, and so violently contradictory in others? To the detectives, it suggested a script, a pre-agreed-upon version of events, and where the contradictions appeared, it signaled a failure of that script, a moment where individual memory had failed to adhere to the collective line. The suspicion of a coordinated strategy, a wall of silence, was no longer a quiet theory. It became an open line of questioning. The friends were pressed. They were confronted with the inconsistencies in their own timelines. They were asked, directly, why their accounts did not match. It was in one of these high-pressure exchanges that the wall finally showed a crack. It was not a confession, it was something almost more damaging. It was an explanation. Russell O'Brien, Jane Tanner's husband, was being questioned about the shifting timelines. He was pushed on the glaring discrepancies. His response was not an attempt to clarify his memory. It was not a defense of his confusion. It was, instead, a declaration of loyalty. He stated, flatly, that he was not going to dishonor the promise he had assumed with Kate and Jerry. The words hung in the air, electric and devastating. A promise. He continued, clarifying the nature of this agreement. Kate and Jerry, he explained, wanted to control all information that was disclosed. This was the moment the investigation pivoted. This was not a grieving friend struggling to remember. This was a man admitting to a conscious, deliberate strategy of information management. The group was not simply cooperating with the police. They were filtering the information the police received. The term that had been whispered by skeptical journalists and frustrated detectives was now given life by one of the group's own members. It was a pact. The admission was not isolated. David Payne, another friend from the group, made a similar, stark declaration. When pressed on the internal conflicts of their stories, and specifically on the contradictions surrounding Robert Murat, his response was just as blunt. "We have a pact," he said. "This is our matter only. This is our matter only." The words were a line drawn in the sand. It redefined the group's relationship with the police. They were not partners in a search. They were a closed circle, and the police were on the outside. For the investigators, this was a catastrophic revelation. It explained everything, and it explained nothing. It explained the shifting stories, the controlled demeanor, the unified front. It suggested that the group had something to protect. But what? Was this the understandable, if misguided, reaction of intelligent people panicking under the glare of suspicion, trying to protect their reputations and their friends from a hostile investigation? Was it an attempt to shield Kate and Jerry from further unbearable pain? Or was it something more? Was this pact of silence built to protect the group not from a stranger, but from a truth hidden within their own circle? Was the wall they had built designed to keep the police out, or to keep a terrible secret in? The pact of silence was no longer a theory. It was an admitted fact. And for the Portuguese police, it transformed the group from tragic victims into the investigation's primary and most formidable adversaries. The investigation had reached an impasse, a wall built of words. The admissions from Russell O'Brien and David Payne had fundamentally and permanently altered the landscape. The police were no longer investigating a simple, tragic event. They were confronting a strategy. The Pact of Silence was a declaration that the group, and the group alone, would be the arbiters of what constituted the truth. This was an intolerable situation for the detectives. Their case files were overflowing with statements that, when placed side by side, canceled one another out. The timeline of the night was not a line at all, but a chaotic scribble of contradictions. There was Jane Tanner's abductor, and there was Jeremy Wilkins's empty road. There was Matthew Oldfield's initial account of the children's room, and his later, revised memory of more light. There was the group's insistence on Robert Murat's presence, and the staff's insistence on his absence. Words had become the problem. They were malleable, unreliable, and, it now seemed, contractual, subject to the terms of an internal promise. Frustrated and running out of conventional options, the investigators decided to force the issue. They moved to deploy one of the most powerful and fundamental tools in any complex case. When words fail, an investigation must turn to actions. They made the formal request for a full-scale reconstruction of events. This was not a minor suggestion. It was a critical, procedural demand. The purpose of a reconstruction is not theatrical. It is a precise, investigative scalpel used to expose impossibilities. It is designed to test a story against the unyielding laws of time and physical space. It would, the police believed, be the definitive way to break the gridlock. The plan was simple. They would take every member of the group, one by one, back to that evening. They would be asked to recreate, in real time, their exact movements. Not what they thought they did, but what they did. The reconstruction would have been the ultimate test. Jane Tanner would be asked to walk her route again. Where, exactly, did she see the man? Where was she standing? Where were Jerry and Jeremy standing? This single act could have validated her sighting or exposed its impossibility. Jeremy Wilkins, in turn, would stand in his spot. The entire sequence would be played out before him. Jerry McCann would be asked to reenact his check. How long did he take? What path did he walk? Matthew Oldfield would be asked to demonstrate his own check, to stand where he stood, to listen as he listened. The timing of every single departure from and return to the restaurant table would be measured, second by second, and cross-referenced. This was the investigators' gamble. They believed that the pact was a verbal agreement, a story polished by consensus. A reconstruction would shatter that consensus. It would force each person, individually, to stand alone and physically commit to their version of events. It is one thing to say something in a room. It is quite another to perform it on the actual stage, under the cold, watchful eyes of the police. The police were betting that the fabricated story, if it was one, could not survive the pressure of its own physical reenactment. The request was made. It was not just a challenge to their story. It was an offer of vindication. If the group's account was true, the reconstruction would prove it. It would silence the growing whispers. It would show the world that their system, their timeline, and their terrible misfortune were all exactly as they had described. Any innocent person, investigators reasoned, any parent desperate to find their child and clear their name, would seize this opportunity. The response from the group was immediate. It was absolute. And it was unanimous. They refused. Every single member of the group declined to participate. Not one of them would agree to retrace their steps on the night Madeleine vanished. The unity that had appeared so fractured in their individual statements was suddenly, miraculously, restored. They were a perfect, solid wall of defiance. For the investigators, this refusal was the loudest sound they had yet heard. It was more eloquent than any of the conflicting statements. It was, in their view, an admission. Not necessarily an admission of guilt for a crime, but an admission that their story, the one they had all promised to protect, could not withstand a simple test of physical reality. The refusal to participate was an act of profound self-preservation. It confirmed the pact was not just about controlling information, it was about preventing its verification. Why would Jane Tanner refuse to show the police where she saw her daughter's abductor? Why would the group refuse to validate the checking system they insisted was so rigorous? The questions were, for the police, rhetorical. The refusal was the answer. It was the collapse of the last, critical opportunity to clarify the truth of that night. The investigation was now truly stalled, frozen by the very people at its center. The sequence of events on that evening would remain locked forever in their compromised, contradictory, and now, fiercely guarded, words. The reconstruction that could have solved everything was, itself, the event that never was. The group's unanimous refusal to participate in the reconstruction was a slammed door. It had left the Portuguese investigators in a procedural void, robbed of their most effective tool for finding the truth. The physical reenactment was impossible. The Pact of Silence was holding. With the path forward blocked, the detectives had no choice but to go back. They returned to the only thing they had, the words. They retrieved the stacks of paper, the original witness statements taken in the first chaotic days, and laid them side by side with the more formal, considered testimonies given in the weeks that followed. They were no longer searching for simple, panicked errors. They were hunting for something far more deliberate. They were looking for evolution. They were looking for the places where the story had been repaired. The narrative of that night was a complex, delicate mechanism, and the investigators had found the part that was broken. The timeline simply did not work. It was fractured by a fundamental, unresolvable conflict. On one hand, Jane Tanner had seen a man carrying a child at approximately 9:15. This was the group's only piece of evidence pointing to a stranger. On the other hand, Matthew Oldfield had performed a check at 9:30 and reported that all was well. Both of these statements could not be true. If Matthew Oldfield's check was accurate, then the children were all safe in their beds at 9:30. The man Jane Tanner saw a quarter of an hour earlier could not have been Madeleine's abductor. Her sighting, the entire stranger theory, would be rendered irrelevant, a meaningless coincidence. The group's narrative, the investigators realized, had a fatal flaw. It needed a correction. And as they scrutinized the progression of the statements, they found it. The first part of the timeline was stable. Jerry McCann's account of his check at around 9:05 was consistent. He had entered the apartment, seen his children, and noted specifically that the window and shutters were firmly closed. This was his fixed, unwavering memory. The critical change came from Matthew Oldfield. In his initial, hurried statements, he had reported his check at 9:30 as unremarkable. He had entered the apartment, stood at the threshold of the children's bedroom, and listened. He heard nothing. The silence of sleeping children was all the reassurance he needed. He left and returned to the table to report that all was quiet. But in a later, more formal interview, his memory had improved. It had not just improved. It had acquired a new, vital, and incredibly convenient detail. He now recalled that as he stood in the doorway, he had noticed something. He did not just hear the silence, he saw something. There had been more light in the room than he first recalled. It was a different quality of light than he would have expected. He had not, he explained, processed its significance at the time. But now, in hindsight, he understood. The extra illumination, he now believed, must have been coming from the street. It was, he now testified, as if the shutters were already raised. This was not a small correction. This was the linchpin. This single revised memory was the narrative glue that suddenly and perfectly bonded the entire, broken story together. With this new detail, the timeline was miraculously healed. The contradiction was erased. The man Jane Tanner saw at 9:15 was the abductor. The abduction, therefore, had occurred between 9:05, when Jerry saw the shutters closed, and 9:15, when Jane saw the man. This meant that when Matthew Oldfield arrived for his check at 9:30, Madeleine was already gone. The room was already compromised. The shutters were already open. His revised memory of the light in the room was the proof. His check was no longer a contradiction. It was a tragic, missed opportunity. He had simply failed to register the signs of a crime that had already been committed. To the group, this must have felt like a resolution, a way for all their stories to finally make sense. But to the investigators, this adjustment was the most damning piece of evidence yet. It was, to them, a blatant and clumsy act of narrative fabrication. It was too perfect. It was the precise, surgical correction required to validate Jane Tanner's sighting and to keep the stranger abduction theory alive. They felt it was the unmistakable, tangible proof of the Pact of Silence in action. This was not just a refusal to speak. This was a coordinated, collaborative effort to rewrite the past. The friends were not just witnesses. They had become authors. The quiet, internal frustrations of the Portuguese investigators, contained for weeks behind the closed doors of interview rooms and procedural reports, finally breached their banks. They did not just leak, they erupted. The vehicle was the Portuguese press. A weekend newspaper, Sol, published a long, meticulously detailed and explosive investigative article. It was a journalistic bombshell, and it signaled that the private war between the detectives and the group of friends had now become a public one. This was not the speculative, sensational reporting that had characterized some of the foreign media. This was a clinical dissection of the case, and its proximity to the official investigation was obvious. The article laid bare, for the first time to a stunned public, the full spectrum of contradictions that had been poisoning the inquiry. It spoke of the timeline that did not work. It detailed the impossibility of the view from the restaurant. It highlighted the group's strange, collective routines. It spoke of the pact of silence. And it named, one by one, every single friend at the table that night as being under suspicion. The article, however, reserved its sharpest focus for the parents. It pierced the protective bubble of their victimhood, treating them not as grieving figures, but as the central, unresolved components of the mystery. This public exposure was the prelude to the inevitable formal escalation. The investigators, convinced by the shifting story of Matthew Oldfield and utterly galvanized by the group's collective refusal to participate in the reconstruction, had reached their conclusion. The theory of a stranger abduction, in their minds, was no longer viable. The only remaining path led directly back to apartment 5A, and to the adults responsible for the children being left there. The investigators moved. Kate McCann and Jerry McCann were formally and publicly named arguidos. This was not an arrest. It was not a charge. But in the context of the Portuguese legal system and in the blinding glare of the world's media, the distinction was meaningless. It was a formal declaration of suspicion. It meant the police believed they had sufficient cause to investigate the parents not as witnesses, but as potential participants in a crime. The search for a missing child had officially and catastrophically transformed into an investigation centered on her own mother and father. With this new, formal status came a renewed focus on a detail that had been present from the early stages, a detail that now acquired a chilling, profound significance. It was the name Kate Healy. This had been noted before, in quiet observations. The lead detective, in his internal paperwork and in his conversations, had insisted on using her maiden name. The Soul article had done the same. Now, it became the standard. In the cold official language of the investigation, she was no longer Kate McCann, the mother, the wife, the doctor. She was Kate Healy, the individual, the arguda. This was not an accident of translation. It was a deliberate, psychological strategy. It was an act of profound clinical deconstruction. The name McCann represented a unit, a family, a respectable, professional couple united in their grief. That name carried with it a powerful, sympathetic narrative. It was the name of a victim. The name Healy was an act of separation. It severed her, legally and psychologically, from that unit. It isolated her from her husband. It stripped her of the protective mantle of motherhood. It reduced her from a grieving parent at the center of a tragedy to a single, solitary individual whose timeline did not add up, whose story had shifted, and who had, along with her friends, refused to cooperate with the most fundamental and critical request of the investigation. The weight of that name was immense. It was the investigation's most powerful statement. It declared that they were no longer listening to the grieving mother. They were, instead, formally and suspiciously, interrogating the woman named Healy. The battle lines were no longer just drawn. They were fortified. The parents were now fighting not only an unseen abductor, but the very people who held the power to find him. The public declaration of the parents as arguidos was a profound and irreversible step. It had solidified the Portuguese investigation's official stance, drawing a clear, confrontational line. But in doing so, it had also, in an instant, transferred the true center of the conflict. The case was no longer a purely domestic, Portuguese matter. It had become a complex, international legal entanglement, a diplomatic minefield between Lisbon and London. The McCanns were British citizens. More importantly, the entire supporting cast, the friends, the members of the Pact, the witnesses to the shifting timelines were also British citizens. The group had long since returned to the United Kingdom, insulated by distance and by the robust protection of their own legal system. The Pact of Silence, born in the confusing panic of a resort, had now had weeks to harden. It was no longer a whispered, informal promise. It had almost certainly become a coordinated legal strategy, fortified by high-level advisors. For the Portuguese detectives, this was the ultimate frustration. They had their arguidos, but their key witnesses were untouchable, an ocean away. The investigators were convinced that the Pact was the key. They believed that if they could only break one member, if they could legally and forcefully confront one of them with the full weight of their contradictions, the entire, carefully constructed narrative would collapse. They needed to re-interview the friends, not as polite, grieving witnesses, but as hostile participants in a potential cover-up, as accessories to the Pact. They needed to challenge Matthew Oldfield's revised memory. They needed to confront Jane Tanner with Jeremy Wilkins's testimony. They needed to do it in a formal, intimidating setting. To do this, they had only one weapon. They could not simply fly to England. They had to petition the British government for help. The mechanism for this was a formal letter of request, a document of immense legal weight, to be sent from the Portuguese judiciary to the British Home Office. This document was, in effect, the entire case. It contained everything: the justification for their suspicions, the full list of contradictions, the evidence of the shifting stories, and the blunt refusal of the group to participate in the reconstruction. This letter was not just a request for interviews. It was also a request for seizure. The investigators desperately wanted two items: Kate McCann's personal diary, in which she had been meticulously recording her thoughts since the disappearance, and Jerry McCann's laptop. The police believed these items were not just personal effects. They were potential records of the Pact, a logbook of the narrative's construction. The documents were drafted. The requests were finalized. The entire, complex, and fragile future of the investigation was sealed in an envelope and dispatched from the Algarve to the central authorities in Lisbon, from where it would make its formal journey to London. And then, nothing. The investigators in Praia da Luz waited. They were now completely powerless. Having made their move, they could only sit and watch as the trail grew colder. 1 week passed, then 2. A month. The case was completely, agonizingly frozen. The world's media, watching this inexplicable inactivity, began to form its own conclusions. The Portuguese police, it seemed, were either incompetent or had badly overplayed their hand. The blame, publicly, was directed at the British. A diplomatic standoff was underway. The Portuguese investigators fumed, convinced their British counterparts were deliberately dragging their feet, protecting their own citizens from a foreign legal system. The accusations flew, rising to the level of the British Home Secretary, who was publicly criticized for the perceived and politically charged delay. The stalemate continued, the case paralyzed, until a new internal discovery was made. It was not a clue. It was an administrative audit. The letter of request, the single most important, time-sensitive, and critical document in the entire investigation, had never been sent. It had not been lost in transit. It had not been rejected by London. It had never left Portugal. It was found, weeks later, sitting, unsent, in an office in Lisbon, a victim of a colossal, incomprehensible bureaucratic blunder. It had been misplaced in the administrative shuffle between judicial offices. By the time the error was discovered, the moment was gone. The opportunity was lost forever. The element of surprise, the chance to seize the diary and the laptop while they were still raw, the ability to confront the friends before their legal defenses were perfectly impenetrable, all of it had evaporated. The documents were eventually sent, of course, but it no longer mattered. The delay had been fatal. The investigation, which had survived conflicting witnesses, a contaminated scene, and a wall of silence, was now, finally, and irreversibly, defeated. It had not been undone by a clever adversary or a lack of evidence. It had been killed by a simple, catastrophic administrative mistake. The case, for all intents and purposes, was over. The catastrophic failure of the letter of request was not just an administrative error. It was a final, fatal event. The official Portuguese investigation, which had been running on the fumes of suspicion and procedural friction, effectively died. It did not end with a conclusion, or a charge that would hold, or an arrest. It simply, and silently, expired. The case was now a ghost, haunting the corridors of a justice system that had failed to act, its momentum broken by a single, misplaced file. The arguido status of the McCanns remained, a formal stain on a file that was now gathering dust, but the active, daily threat of the investigation had evaporated. But the paralysis of the official police did not mean the search itself had stopped. In the vacuum left by the stalled investigation, a new one had already been born. This investigation was parallel, private, and powerful. It was funded by the enormous, swelling wave of public donations, and it operated under a completely different and opposing set of assumptions. While the Portuguese police had spent months looking inward, deconstructing the group's pact, and analyzing the impossible physics of the timeline, this new, private investigation looked exclusively outward. Its sole premise was the one the police had come to dismiss: the stranger abduction. Its mission was not to verify the group's timeline, but to find the man who had exploited it. And it was this investigation that now brought forward a new, and deeply compelling, thread. A new witness had emerged, one who was not part of the friends' circle. Her name was Gail Cooper. She was another holiday maker, a tourist who had been staying at the same resort. Her testimony had nothing to do with the night of the disappearance itself. It was, perhaps, even more chilling. She spoke of the days before the 3rd of May. She had, she stated, seen a man. He was not on holiday. He was not one of the staff. He was a creepy figure, an individual who simply did not belong. She described seeing him loitering, a watchful, unsettling presence. She had seen him twice on the beach, and once, more alarmingly, near her own holiday villa. He was, in her memory, an observer, someone studying the resort, its guests, and its routines. The private investigation seized upon this testimony. This was precisely what they were looking for. It was evidence of premeditation. It was the predator, hunting. Working with this witness, the McCann's team commissioned a new, detailed artist's impression. An ephit was created. This was not the vague, disputed figure from Jane Tanner's fleeting, nighttime sighting. This was a face, built from the memory of multiple, sustained, daylight observations. It was the face of the man who was watching. The image was released to the world, and it exploded. The media, starved of any official progress, now had a tangible, frightening focus. The sketch was everywhere. It was the new face of the case, the man they were all hunting. The public response was immediate. Sightings were reported from all over Portugal, from South America, from across Europe. The search, which had been frozen in the corridors of Lisbon, was now active and global, energized by this single, disturbing image. For the official Portuguese police, however, this development was viewed with deep, profound cynicism. They quietly, and sometimes publicly, dismissed the lead. The sketch, they stated, was without credibility. It was too generic. It could, they noted with exasperation, match hundreds, if not thousands, of men. To the stalled investigators, this was not a breakthrough. It was a distraction. It was a red herring, a deliberate act of narrative manipulation originating from the arguidos themselves. They saw it as a desperate and expensive attempt to shift the world's focus away from the apartment, away from the pact, and onto a faceless phantom. This created the case's most bitter divide. On one side stood the official, but now impotent, investigation, which had concluded the stranger theory was a fiction. On the other stood a new, immensely well-funded private machine, reportedly spending £50,000 a month, which was pouring all its resources into chasing a lead the police themselves believed was a ghost. The official case was closed, but the public hunt had just begun, focused on a man the police were convinced had never existed at all. The passage of time has done nothing to resolve the core, fundamental contradictions of the case. Years have passed, yet the official record remains a testament not to a failed search, but to a failed investigation, one that collapsed under the weight of its own internal paradoxes, administrative failures, and, above all, a defiant, impenetrable human silence. The truth of what happened on the 3rd of May did not just vanish with a missing child. It was, it seems, deliberately, methodically, and successfully interred. The unresolved questions are not small, lingering details. They are the entire foundation of the case, and they remain as fractured today as they were in the first explosive weeks. The very architecture of the stranger abduction theory, the one the world was asked to believe, still rests on a single, contested moment. It rests on the memory of Jane Tanner, who claimed to see a man carrying a child at 9:15. Yet that memory is rendered an impossibility by the equally firm, independent testimony of Jeremy Wilkins, who stood in that exact location, at that exact time, and swore he saw nothing. This paradox was never reconciled. It was simply, and convenience, bypassed. It was bypassed by the group's own internal narrative adjustments. The most significant of these was the revised memory of Matthew Oldfield, the story of the light in the room that changed as if the shutters were open. This was the single crucial pivot. It was a memory that evolved, becoming the perfect solution to the timeline's fatal flaw. It explained how Jane Tanner's sighting could be real, even if Matthew Oldfield's own check at 9:30 had found nothing. But this solution, so perfect in its utility, has always felt, to investigators, like a signature. It was the clear, tangible evidence of the Pact of Silence in action, not just as a refusal to speak, but as a collaborative effort to construct a truth that could withstand scrutiny. And then there was the most defiant act of all, the group's unanimous refusal to participate in the police reconstruction. This was the moment the Pact ceased to be a passive agreement and became an active, unified blockade. It was a declaration that their story, the one they had all promised to protect, would never be subjected to the test of physical reality. This refusal hangs over the case, an admission far louder than any confession. It was the ultimate act of information control, a moment when the group, unified, chose to protect their narrative over the one act that might have clarified it. The physical, unanswered questions are just as profound. The heavy shutters. The police, from the beginning, were baffled by them. How were they opened from the outside without a loud, clattering noise that would have woken the children? And how did an intruder, a stranger, enter a small bedroom, identify one specific child among 3, and remove her, all while leaving her twin siblings sleeping, undisturbed, mere feet away? These details do not align with the behavior of an opportunistic stranger. They suggest something else, something quieter, something that possessed an internal logic that has never been explained. The investigation itself was, in the end, a parallel tragedy. The Portuguese detectives, convinced they were facing a wall of deception, made their one critical move. They prepared the letter of request. It was their last, best chance to break the pact, to seize the diaries, to confront the witnesses on their home soil. And that letter, the single most important document in the entire case, was lost in a bureaucratic void. It sat, unsent, in a Lisbon office, a casualty of simple, human error. By the time it was found, the moment was gone. The trail was cold. The Pact had won, defeating the investigation not with cleverness, but by default. 2 realities are now left, 2 investigations that ran in opposite directions and will never meet. One, the official police theory, points inward to a night of unfathomable tragedy, followed by a panicked, desperate, and unbreakable agreement to control the narrative. The other, the one pursued by the private investigation, points outward to a face in the crowd, a creepy man, a phantom who haunts the edges of the story. The truth, whatever its shape, is still there, locked in the silence of that group and in the unbridgeable void between those two opposing realities. The silence, in the end, was the only thing that held. It is the only thing that remains. And in a case defined by its noise, its cameras, and its chaos, it is the silence that speaks the loudest, a permanent, haunting, and unbreakable wall.